So the medical schools also receive funding from the pharmaceutical companies, and they control the curriculum. So they're not, all they're taught is really like the schedule that they must be given. They're not taught about the ingredients of the vaccines. They're not taught about the lack of safety studies of the vaccine. I have a bunch of links too that I can give you guys later. But yeah.
So I know a few of the names that you mentioned, but one of the surprising ones that you would mention is Sherry Tenpenny, because I mean she is one of those people that's so full of bullshit that it's really hard to even take anything she says seriously, because she has a tendency to post graphs online where she cuts pieces off of them and then says, "Oh, look at what the statistics show." And then when you see what the actual published science graph shows, it shows the exact opposite of what she said.
No, that's what Provax enthusiasts do. They actually show the graphs a year before the vaccine was invented, but completely omit all of the information decades before, showing that diseases were already on the decline before the invention of the vaccine.
But she
Well,
just knows that it
I
looks
have that.
good.
Well, it's funny because I have the same argument about the Provax lobby. So, for instance, what they do is when diseases were on the decline, what they do is actually they don't show the information that diseases were on decline before the introduction of the vaccine. They show it at the introduction of the vaccine. So it looks like the vaccine comes in and then the diseases started declining. But before that, diseases started declining when they started to introduce like plumbing, sanitation, water treatment, stuff like that.
Yeah,
So,
but
so what, so
no
what,
one will argue that sanitation doesn't lead to less disease. But what they
yeah.
will argue is that the decline from the advent of sanitation was extremely slow, and then the introduction of vaccines happened, and the chart basically goes like that.
Well, it
So
wasn't. It
it was.
wasn't.
I mean, no,
Well,
that's not.
So there were no vaccines for cholera, for typhoid, for scarlet fever. Those declined as well.
Okay.
So I mean, how do you explain that?
How do you explain
Those
that certain diseases just decline because of modern medicine?
No, because of sanitation. Those are diseases that decline
But there's
because
no correlation between the time of sanitation and the decline of those diseases. If you
yes,
look
there
at the
is.
time when the sanitation was introduced, it was usually introduced incredibly early. And
Like
in places
when?
where there
What
isn't
time?
good sanitation, like India and
Yeah.
Africa, those diseases are still not prevalent.
That's another just straight up lie. I got this from the World Health Organization. I'm reading second paragraph, second line. Contaminated water can transmit diseases such as diarrhea, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and polio. Now, we didn't have like sewage systems that were adequate. People would throw their trash in the street. We didn't have trash collection. We didn't have incinerator. We had incinerators. We had horses going around pooping everywhere. We lived in very close quarters with not a lot of space in these cities where we would have disease outbreaks. So that's a huge thing to be taken into consideration. There was a time where doctors didn't even believe in washing their hands. And, but once people start to figure that out and they start implementing this into society, the disease and mortality rates start to go down. And by the time the vaccines were introduced, they were already almost gone anyway. So it didn't have anything to do with the vaccines. And if you can look at this chart up above, this is taken from Australia, mostly Western countries like Wales, United States, England kept records of this. So if you look at graphs from other countries, they show the same thing. There's no vaccine for scarlet fever. There was one they tried to develop for typhoid, but it wasn't a widespread one. And then the other ones, look how, diseases are almost, people are dying from them are almost, non-existent now before the vaccine even came into effect. Also, I would like to note in a lot of third world countries, they still don't have proper sanitation, and they do have these diseases. So I don't really know where he's getting the fact that, they have these diseases. They don't have these diseases anymore, yet they still have bad sanitation. They do. They still have bad sanitation, and they still have these diseases. So this is a really good reference to show why vaccines are not attributable to the decline in U.S. mortality in the last century. The inevitable misconception that arises when discussing vaccination is that the vaccines lower the mortality in the US, and therefore, no matter any shortcomings of vaccination, vaccines have saved lives and are therefore necessary. But is that really the case? Did vaccines lower the mortality rates of these diseases that they are purportedly protecting us against? According to JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the most prestigious medical journals, the answer is no. Vaccines are not attributable to saving lives. In fact, the true reason for the drastic decline in mortality rates of these diseases is attributable to the theory of epidemiological transition. This is taken from the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA, 1999. So it explains what the theory of epidemiological transition is. Simply put, this means that better improvements in living conditions, sanitation, modern healthcare, and medicine, like penicillin and antibiotics, replace infectious diseases. So this is from JAMA again, 1999. It says, over the last 100 years, North America and Europe have experienced a substantial decline in mortality and an increase in life expectancy. The theory of epidemiologic transition attributes these trends to the transition from an age of pestilence and famine, in which the mortality pattern was dominated by high rates of infectious disease deaths, especially in the young, to the current age of degenerative and man-made diseases, in which mortality from chronic disease predominates. So, moving down, going down here, I'm down here. Vaccines are not included in this theory. In fact, it was originally poised, I don't know if I'm saying that right, by Abdul Orman in 1971, at a time when the polio vaccine, the first widely disseminated vaccine in the US, had only hit the market in 1955. The measles vaccine came in 63 and the mumps in 67. That was all the vaccines that were on the market when Oman's now widely held theory of epidemiological transition was observed. The chart, the below chart demonstrates that annual mortality rates did not drastically decline due to the increased use of vaccinations. The graph is the average mortality rate in the US when the 9 categories of infectious diseases are added together as an overall average. The 9 diseases are pneumonia and influenza, they're put into one category, tuberculosis, diphtheria, pertussis, which is whooping cough, measles, typhoid, dysentery, and syphilis and Sequoia, I don't know if I'm saying that right, and AIDS. Bear in mind, vaccinations did not become prominent until the 1950s and 60s, and those were only for half of the diseases. Note the mortality rates level off at the time of vaccines implementation. And if you notice too, when they show that, vaccines, when the Provax lobby show, they usually start the graph like a year or so or like right when the vaccine is invented. So they don't include usually information from the or they don't, beyond the year that the vaccine is invented. So looking at the last century's mortality rate. Pediatrics, the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, considered the gold standard for pediatricians, describes the same historical trends in mortality. The vast decline in mortality occurred before vaccines were invented. Between 1900 and 1988, the death rate from the major infectious diseases declined 99.7%, from 466 to 0.7 deaths per 100,000. The percentage of the child deaths attributable to infectious disease declined from 61.6 to 2%. This decline incorporates the emergence of human immunodeficiency, HIV virus with age, in which 1998 accounted for 0.3% of child deaths. Once again, nearly 90% of the decline in infectious disease mortality among U.S. children occurred before 1940, when few antibiotics or vaccines were available. This is Pediatrics, 2000. Below we see 3 periods of drastic decreases in mortality for diseases that cannot be attributed to vaccines, because half of the diseases still don't have a vaccine. Yet they are precipitously dropped to near zero mortality rate without the aid of vaccines. The below chart is taken from infectious disease and epidemiology. So there you go. There you have it. All right. In fact, as the chart below clearly shows, measles, diphtheria, whooping cough all saw the sharpest declines in mortality rates before the creation of their respective vaccines. Additionally, scarlet fever and typhoid show the same drastic decline over the same period, and as you can recall, there are no vaccines for these diseases. Okay. Last one, the debate on vaccine efficacy in the U.S. history often leads down the path of the so-called eradication of smallpox. Advocates will claim that the smallpox vaccine was responsible for its disappearance. Dr. Susan Humphreys, MD, I might add, differs with that. So if you look at the video, I can put the video in the links, but starting around 4:15 the video, she says, only 5 to 10% of the Earth's population was ever vaccinated for smallpox. And it was done during a time when there were lots of sanitation occurring, which meant that there were fewer problem rodents and insects around that were able to carry the disease from person to person. It meant that people's immune system improved because of better nutrition and child labor laws. So there were lots of things occurring during this period when smallpox disappeared. However, now you know, back during the time of smallpox, it was chickenpox, monkeypox, goatpox, horsepox. There were all kinds of pox that looked identical that were very hard to tell apart. We still have monkeypox on the planet. So many of these diseases that we all lump together just because we didn't have genetic testing, we still have these diseases. If you look at a person, a victim of monkeypox, it looks just like smallpox. So the question is, do we really eradicate smallpox? I have my doubts about it.